current chair of the Department of Germanic Languages, and it's my great honor and pleasure to moderate tonight's event with Daniel Kehlmann and Johannes von Moltke. And obviously I will introduce them, but I first thought I would like to share a few remarks on the history of the Mosse lecture, and assuming that some of you might be here for the first time and not familiar with the format. And I'd like to start with this slide. I know many of you know this building quite well. This is the Mosse Center in the heart of Berlin, Berliner Schützenstraße.
Could you speak a little louder, please?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Turn up the mic or something.
It's up.
Mike war an, aber du musst es näher.
Is it now? Hello. Good evening. Once again, welcome to Deutsches Haus, and for coming on this rainy day. So this is the Mosse Center in the heart of Berlin, Berliner Schützenstraße, in the former press quarter of the city, and this was the home or house of the Mosse Verlag. Founded by Rudolf Mosse in 1867, the Mosse Verlag became one of the most influential media companies in Wilhelminen, Weimar, Germany. Its flagship, the Berliner Tageblatt, was one of the most respected and widely read newspapers in the German-speaking world, known for its liberal and democratic values, and read by those who believed in a free public sphere. This was exactly why it became a target. When the Nazis rose to power, the Mosse publishing house was seized, its editors and the Mosse family forced into exile, and its papers shut down. The last issue of the Berliner Tageblatt appeared in January 1939. Many decades later, after the end of the war and after the wall between the two Germanys came down, the Mosse Center was renovated and it became home to new and different institutions. One of them was the German department of Humboldt University. And I spent quite some time in this building. I think we were on the third or fourth floor, and I have very fond memories of this time. And I believe some of us, some here do share these memories, I hope. It was here and in 1997 that the Mosse Lecture series was founded by Georg Mosse, the historian and grandson of Rudolf Mosse, and Klaus Scherpe, professor of German literature, culture, and media at Humboldt University. And its mission was defined by Georg Mosse's scholarship. In books such as The Crises of German Ideology, Nazi Culture, and the Nationalization of the Masses, Mosse excavated the deeper historical roots of Nazi ideology, especially the transformation of mass culture into a tool of political mobilization. His work was pathbreaking for generations of scholars. Georg Mosse himself delivered the inaugural lecture on May 14, 1997, in the atrium of the Mosse Zentrum, speaking in German about the liberal legacy and the National Socialist public sphere. In that lecture, he issued a warning about the alienation of the educated elite from political reality. The over-enthusiasm for culture, he said, obscured the view of realities when the Nazis came to power. He also pointed out that after the Nazis were defeated, the ideas and impulses they exploited did not simply disappear with them, leaving behind a legacy of ashes and rubble that demands our continued historical vigilance. Since then, the Mosse Lecture series has aimed to connect humanities research directly with urgent global issues, fostering critical approaches to contemporary challenges such as climate change, political polarization, and perhaps most critically, the resurgence of authoritarian regimes in democratic societies. The series quickly became, in my opinion, one of the most significant intellectual events in Berlin, and it also produced many important publications. just showing this one slide. On the right, you see the Mosse Almanac, which came out 20 years of the anniversary, edited by Elisabeth Wagner. It includes the inaugural lecture from which I just quoted. And Elisabeth Wagner just wrote this wonderful book on the women in the Mosse family. But the heart and center of the Mosse Lecture series is in Madison, Wisconsin. Organized by the Mosse Foundation and the George Mosse Program in History in Madison, what started as a single series has since expanded into a truly global endeavor, with lectures now taking place across 3 continents. At the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where George Mosse taught, as well as at UC Berkeley, Cornell, the University of Amsterdam, and here in New York. And I'm leaving out several other locations. Outreach was, in fact, one of the key points George Mosse emphasized in that inaugural lecture. He argued that scholarship must not become isolated, that the university has an obligation to engage with the world outside its gates, and that humanistic inquiry achieves its highest purpose when it interacts with the political and social realities of its time. It's a mission statement that has grown more relevant each day, and perhaps never felt more urgent than it does today. A moment when the free press, the very thing the Mosse House stood for, and higher education, especially the humanities, feel a mounting pressure to retreat from its commitments to critical inquiry and critical thinking, increasingly unsure what are we allowed to say. I believe that in this context, an institution like the Global Mosse Lecture Series, created specifically to bridge the gap between scholarship and the public sphere, becomes not just valuable but essential. The defense of free intellectual and public life is what this series is fundamentally about. Before I now move on to introducing the guest speakers, I would like to say some important thanks, first of all, to the Mosse Foundation, especially to Roger Strauch, the trustee of the Mosse Foundation, who is now supporting us for the 4th year. This is the 4th annual Mosse Lecture. And I'd like to thank Sky Doney. He's right here in the audience. Sky is the director of the George Mosse Program in History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the Hebrew University. By the way, we will have a reception after the discussion, so please stick around and learn more about their important work. I would also like to thank Andreas Hüssen. Many of you know he is the Willer Professor Emeritus of German and Comparative Literature at Columbia, and it was Andreas who, along with Roger Strauch, had the vision and idea to bring the Mosse Lectures to Columbia. And finally, a heartfelt thanks to colleagues in our department, colleagues without whom we would get nothing organized, and that is Sam Gomez and Kerstin Hofmann. Thank you. One of the main features of this series is its openness to voices from outside academia. Over nearly 30 years, the Mosse Lectures have featured a wide range of writers, artists, and public intellectuals, and I'm very pleased that tonight we continue this tradition with a lecture by Daniel Kehlmann, one of the most important German language novelists and playwrights of his generation. As you may know, Kehlmann is the author of the international bestseller Measuring the World, translated into over 40 languages, and many other award-winning novels and books like Till or Fame, a novel in 9 stories. He was the Eberhard Behrens Chair at NYU and is a member of the Deutsche Akademie für Sprache und Dichtung. His latest novel, The Director, named by the New York Times as one of the 10 most important books of 2025, longlisted for the International Booker Prize, explores the life of filmmaker G.W. Pabst and his involvement with the Nazi era. It's a novel about life under dictatorship, a novel about art and compromise, or art in a compromised world, and it's a novel that turns a historical figure into a contemporary one, making us feel that the past is not entirely behind us. At least that's how I read it. History may not always provide answers to today's problems, but it raises questions we need to ask if we want to understand our time. I believe Kehlmann's novels do just that, and his lecture tonight takes up a very similar question. Daniel Kehlmann, it's a great pleasure to have you here tonight. Following his lecture, we will hear comments from Johannes von Moltke, the Rudolf Arnheim Collegiate Professor at the University of Michigan. He's a leading scholar of German cultural history and film, and has authored award-winning books including No Place Like Home and The Curious Humanist, Siegfried Kracauer in America. Johannes is a former president of the German Studies Association and currently serves as president of the American Friends of Marbach, an organization that is very important to us. It supports our PhD students. Last year, he delivered a series of 3 Mosse lectures at Madison 3 on his new book project on metapolitics and the rise of the new right on both sides of the Atlantic. And if you're interested, and you should be, you can find the recordings on the Mosse lecture website and also on YouTube. It's really, I highly recommend. Thank you, Johannes, for joining us tonight. So the format is we first hear the lecture by Daniel Kehlmann, followed by comments from Johannes, and then we have this very casual seating arrangement so they can have a discussion, and then we want to open the floor for your comments and questions. But first, please welcome Daniel Kehlmann.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor, and I never had a respondent before for. It sounds amazing and vaguely threatening. I don't quite know what to expect, but I'm very happy to have that experience. Also, this is kind of a magical place for me. Last time I was here in a very different world was, I think, in 2014. I was invited by Mark Anderson, who's here tonight, to do a panel with him and James Shapiro, who's traveling, also a great professor at Columbia. And we had a wonderful event, but also it was about playwriting and theater, and I brought one of my plays, and somehow, I don't know exactly how that happened, but Jim and I started reading a scene from my play like actors do, and we had a lot of fun, and then Jim said to me, I like this play, can I show it to my friend Murray? And I said, yeah, sure, show it to all your friends. But it turned out that friend was Murray Abraham, and he ended up doing that play on the West End. So I'm expecting a lot from. Last time worked really well for me. Thank you. But yeah, the times are very different now, and so I chose a more serious subject than last time. On November 9, 1945, Alfred Döblin, arguably the most important living German language novelist alongside Thomas Mann, set foot on German soil again for the first time in 12 years. He did so as a member of the French military. His uniform immediately provoked outrage among German colleagues. I considered it right, Ernst Jünger wrote, to take part in the war on the German side and in German uniform, the very uniform in which my son Ernst fell. Mr. Döblin has marched in among us in French uniform in the wake of foreign troops. It's hard to say what is more unsettling in the sentence from the author of Storm of Steel, the unrepentant imperious phrasing, I considered it right, or the ease with which Jünger passes over the fact that Döblin too had lost a son in the war. In 1940, Wolfgang Döblin took his own life in Husras rather than fall into German captivity. His father never got over his grief, nor did he get over his guilt for having left Wolfgang alone in France. After his return, Döblin worked for the French censorship authority, responsible for the preliminary review of manuscripts. It was his task to ensure that no fascist literature was published in the French-occupied sector of Germany. He also coordinated with the French military authorities about establishing an academy for literature. France made its financial support conditional on the creation of a literature section. Döblin agreed to serve as its president, and for vice president proposed none other than the writer Walter von Molo, a former Nazi fellow traveler. With few exceptions, the other founding fathers of the Academy were former National Socialist Party members as well. At the same time, Döblin completed his last novel, Hamlet oder die lange Nacht nimmt ein Ende, Hamlet or the long night comes to an end, and could not find a publisher in the Federal Republic of Germany. One is to repeat this slowly. The author of Berlin Alexanderplatz could not find a publisher anywhere in West Germany for his novel. When it finally appeared in the GDR, this was of course held against him. How could he publish a book in East Germany and not in the Free West? In 1953, Döblin emigrated for a second time, returning to France. "I'm nothing here," he wrote in his diary. "And in any case, what have I achieved at the end of my life? How am I seen? My way has conquered nothing. My books are too hard, too thick, too full, and too closed. I'm not simple enough, not unequivocal enough. I have already outlived myself without really having noticed that I live. I expect nothing anymore. I am without hope for myself." For all one's rightful indignation, one must also concede that Hamlet or the Long Night Comes to an End has its problems. It is a curiously vague construction built around an empty center. And that center, if we look at it clearly, says a great deal about early post-war Germany, but not exactly in the way the author meant it to. A wounded young English Marine, Edward, loses his leg in a kamikaze attack and is brought back by his parents to their comfortable country house. He's depressed, desperate, helpless, ill. His father, the celebrated writer Gordon Allison, decides to try a form of narrative therapy, healing through storytelling, a Decameron cure. Before long, a motley group gathers. A teacher, a young painter, Edward's intelligent Uncle James, Edward's mother Alice, his sister Kathleen, and of course the father himself. Young Edward is tormented by the question of guilt. His father, by contrast, believes such problems cannot be resolved. Terrible things simply happen. They belong to human life. The world is what it is. Quote, "Gordon spoke up. I wanted to end the eternal abstract quarrel about guilt and responsibility. Let us present concrete cases." End of quote. The oddly negative father/writer figure stands thus for the idea that storytelling makes specific attributions of guilt impossible. Whoever tells a story is forgiving his characters from the outset. Moral philosophy tends to dissolve the concrete into cloudy generalities. Storytelling does the opposite. In a story, universal truths lose themselves in the lowlands of the particular, which is, by the way, a mechanism I tried to put to use in my novel The Director, about a man's gradual compromise with the Third Reich. By telling a concrete story, one step at a time, adhering to the human reality and not passing judgment, it becomes exceedingly hard to pinpoint where exactly metaphysical guilt can be found, if it exists at all. And by the way, why did Döblin use the English setting? Why is it English people who debate the question of guilt in a German book about the Second World War and its aftermath by a German writer who didn't even speak proper English himself? Why the strange move to put at a distance who put himself at a distance by a novelist who didn't have any obvious need to distance himself from all this. Döblin never explained. It is difficult to say whether the great writer in bad health and figuring bouts of depression felt overwhelmed by the task he had taken on, or whether he wanted to experimentally break narrative boundaries. In any case, the novellas soon begin to interlock. The initially separated levels flow into one another, so that as you read, you sometimes can no longer say with certainty which level of fiction you're on. Edward, for instance, demands from his uncle a rewriting of Hamlet. The uncle evasively offers a new Lear instead, whose constellation in turn mirrors the Ellison family dynamics. Increasingly, the stories are about repression and violence. It becomes apparent that there is something in the family one must not speak about. A deep antagonism opens up between father and son. The storytelling cure turns into a form of psychoanalysis until the repressed breaks through. Gordon has tormented his wife for years. He's not, in fact, even Edward's real father. In a great confrontation, everything explodes, the family disintegrates. The novel's ending is, there is no other way to put it, pure melodrama. Edward turns into a religious penitent preparing for monastic life, while his father becomes a wandering shadow, a living ghost, and Alice, the mother, under a new name and with a cosmetically transformed body, becomes a prostitute. Döblin's inclination toward what Joseph Roth called his irritating infantilism shows here without any restraint. Edward, who in an earlier draft was still meant to withdraw from the world into a monastery, now turns back toward the world and becomes a capable citizen. High melodrama, of course. But there is something even stranger about this novel. Perhaps not that strange to Döblin's contemporaries, but exceedingly strange to us, modern readers. Döblin, who fought the rising Nazi party in Weimar Germany like few other intellectuals, had now written a novel about the Second World War, about the topic of guilt, in which the death camps are not mentioned even once. Not explicitly, not even by a hint. Döblin, who railed so angrily against the grand bourgeois Thomas Mann and his mythologizing of German politics, now had done something very similar himself. In the embedded novellas, there is Hydas and Demeter, the Archangel Michael, Lear and Hamlet, Minnesingers and the Virgin Mary. Again and again, a mythic elevation of the historically concrete into symbolic vagueness. Here's another exchange between father and son. The longer one lives, Gordon said, the clearer it becomes. One withdraws more and more from oneself. One gives it up. Edward, and in truth, human beings don't exist. In German, es gibt den Menschen nicht. That's right. That is wisdom's final conclusion. And if you lament it, I lament it too. Edward, and what if human beings do exist, und wenn es doch den Menschen gäbe? Es gibt ihn nicht. They don't exist, Edward. What the Faust material was for Thomas Mann, Marxism for Brecht, the Catholic world of Baroque images, was for the converted Jew Döblin, a way of ignoring what maybe would have mattered most. A writer who so bitterly complained that Christian piety covered over every question of guilt wrote a novel that held back from any conclusion or even from any specificity in regard to deeds and details. How was that possible? The question takes us into the very heart of post-war society, that strange fog in which former exiles lived alongside former perpetrators, and in a curious cartel of silence, together set the German economic miracle in motion. A world in which the survivors displayed the friendly willingness to explain to former perpetrators that the human being does not exist, and therefore, ultimately, neither does guilt. Perhaps the best short story by the great poet Ingeborg Bachmann is titled Under Mördern und Irren, Among Murderers and Madmen. The young author published it in 1961 in her collection Das 30. Jahr, the 30th year. The murderers in the title are, of course, the murderers. That does not require much explanation, but who are the madmen? That is precisely the point. The story has its weaknesses, like Döblin's novel, it descends into melodrama at the end, but in contrast to it is rich in detail. And as a testimony of what it was like, socially, to live in Vienna's post-war years, it is of immense value. About 10 years after the war, an unnamed narrator spends an evening in a tavern with Viennese cultural officials. Haderer, a department head at the local radio, Hutt, a culture manager, and the critic Bertoni. All three were Wehrmacht soldiers 10 years ago, presumably active in violent ways on the Eastern Front. Bertoni got his job at the newspaper only because the Jewish writer Steckel vouched for him. Steckel normally comes to this weekly gathering, but today he has not turned up. But other former exiles have, among them the narrator himself and the writers Herz, Mahler, and Friedel. In the adjacent room, there is singing, a comrades' reunion of former Wehrmacht soldiers. They are singing a Nazi song, 10 years after the war. And the chairman of that reunion is an old friend and brother-in-arms of Bertoni. He comes briefly into their room, greets them cordially, chats a little, goes back. This encounter has agitated and excited the army veterans. I quote, Haderer put his hand over his eyes. I would not want to miss anything, those years, those experiences. Friedel said, like a stubborn schoolboy, but far too quietly, I wouldn't mind having missed them. So it is the victims who suddenly feel ashamed of their own existence. Quote, we were forced to listen and to stare in front of us, crumbling bread on the table. Finally, the narrator goes to the bathroom and meets Friedel there, panic-stricken. Quote, why are we sitting together, for heaven's sake? I don't understand Herz at all. They killed his wife, his mother. I thought desperately. And then I said, I do understand it. Yes, I understand it. Friedel asked, because he has forgotten? Or because since someday he wants it buried? No, I said. That's not it. It has nothing to do with forgetting, nor with forgiving. It has nothing to do with any of that. Back then, after 45, I too thought the world was divided, and forever into good and evil. But the world is dividing itself again already, and differently. It was almost impossible to grasp. It happened so imperceptibly. Now we are mixed again, so that it can divide itself differently. Do you understand? It has gone that far already, even if we don't want to see it. But that still isn't the whole reason for this wretched concord. Friedel cried out, but what then? What is it then? Say something. Is it perhaps because we are all the same anyway, and that's why we sit together? No, I said, we are not the same. And they aren't, of course. But let us step back. After the end of a dictatorship, a time of reckoning will come. That reckoning has to be maddeningly incomplete. If one, rightly, adheres to the by now time-tested narrative that in Germany the networks from the Nazi years remained perhaps not in power, but at least near power, that the prosecution of murderers took place in far too few cases, and that cartels of silence retained too much influence over public discourse, then one must also state that in all other dictatorships this reckoning was far more unsatisfying. No one, not a single person, went to prison for Stalin's mass murderous war against his own population. No one in Spain ever had to pay for entanglement in the fascist regime. No member of the GDR Politburo was held to full account, some to partial account. What is historically unusual about post-war Germany is not that criminals got away unpunished. but rather that so many did not. There were trials, there was a public process of conscience formation, there were debates, re-education, and social change, but how hard that change was, how sluggishly it proceeded, and to how many social neuroses it gave rise. And it was not consistently the case that the victims pressed for reckoning while the perpetrators maintained their silence. That's the confusing, the almost surreal aspect of the German situation from 1945 through the leading 50s, that the victims became part of the Great Silence too. In many cases, they wanted, above all, to go on living. They did not want to think about what had happened for them as well. Forgetting and repression were the tried and true means of being able to live at all. A personal footnote. I do not, of course, want to compare myself to those victims. How could I? And yet even I, neither traumatized nor in any danger, noticed in myself, when put to a very mild test, a regrettable tendency toward conciliatoriness. Toward the end of the interlude of the Biden presidency, I found myself at a very elegant dinner in Manhattan, seated next to a former ambassador of the Trump administration. With pride, he reported how he had secured audiences with Donald Trump for my chancellor, Austria's. I mean, several times. Yes, he said it again, with considerable pride, several times. Repeated meetings with Trump. Around us sat Democrats, in the broad and narrow sense of the word. Well-behaved liberals. They chatted, smiled, ate, and sipped their expensive wine. They heard him, but they were used to such encounters and didn't care much. And what did I do? I did nothing, of course. I mumbled something unintelligible and did not say that for any decent person an encounter with Trump is about as desirable as having to clean a public toilet. And when he then claimed that no American president before Trump had dealt with Russia so ruthlessly, so uncompromisingly, I did not call him a moron to his face. I did not get up and leave. I stayed seated, but I did think of Bachmann's story. And at that point, I still did not know that all these figures of horror would return, something that in Germany and Austria, too, would have very likely happened if the occupying powers, above all the United States, had not prevented it. So tell me, I thought, beside the bragging Republican in Ingeborg Bachmann's words, why are we sitting together? The strange dialectic twist one turn, strange dialectic twists one turn further when we remember that Ingeborg Bachmann could by no means see herself as a former victim. Her father was an NSDAP member, she wrote about that, and an ardent Nazi. In Vienna's post-war years, she surely lived through many nights like the one described in the story, among murderers and madmen. But the perspective of her own experience is not the one she chose for the story. She wrote it from the perspective not only of a man, but of a victim. Today, one would probably find fault with that. It is ultimately the fictional appropriation of a victim's perspective. I would rather see it as simply another astonishing fact from that smeared time, as another contemporary writer called that era. That writer was Hilde Spiel, who at the age of 34 returned, like Döblin, in uniform, in her case British, to her home city in January 1946. With bitter amusement, she notes at the University of Vienna that the portrait of the last rector is still hanging, only a blotch on his chest marks the spot where the party badge was painted over. She travels on to Berlin and attends evening gatherings where, much as in Bachmann's story, only in more elegant rooms and with better crockery, emigres, opportunists, and perpetrators mingle. I quote, "I find it unbearable, quite unbearable, that so much suffering and torment, the dark years, all the martyrdoms, the hunger, the annihilation, should simply be forgotten, because at a certain level one no longer harbors desires for revenge, or because no one you meet is recognizably guilty. Perhaps it cannot be otherwise, but if so, then the world is just sickening, a place without meaning or value." End of quote. She quotes this letter to her husband in the second volume of her autobiography, only to add, "In deep sorrow and not yet recovered from the hardship of war, I could not feel otherwise. I saw things as strict and one-sided as they in reality are not." And then a few pages later, with an oddly cool gaze upon herself, quote, "True enough, we had read Klaus Mann's roman à clef Mephisto. And yet, we now not only admired without reservation Gustav Gründgen's renewed and in fact fascinating work at the Deutsches Theater, we also chatted with him in the most amiable way at a party the so conciliatory CIA man Mike Josselson gave for him, no less amiably, one might think, than he himself may once have conversed with his patron Göring. This evening, I wrote to my mother, we are dining with the actress Käthe Dorsch, the very woman who had good relations with the very Göring, and at times asked him for mercy for a threatened Jew. What really were we to think of our own character? That is quite amazing, no? The people who read and admired Klaus Mann's Mephisto, the roman à clef about a great actor and Nazi opportunist, were now spending nice evenings with Gustav Gründgens, the great actor and Nazi opportunist who famously was the real-life model for the book's main character. And at the same time, the writer and director Ernst Lothar, Max Reinhardt's former assistant, just back from the United States in American uniform, delivers the following rant at a Viennese tavern table. Would, for instance, the professor at our table receive a university chair? He would not receive it, I said. There was no desire for retinees, though one did not officially admit it, and least of all for the famous ones. People wanted to remain among themselves and spare their bruised conscience. We will come back to that quote. Hilde Spiel, meanwhile, reports in an article in the New Statesman on her unease at a concert conducted by Wilhelm Furtwängler. The great conductor had not only accommodated himself to the Nazis, had remained in the country and continued to lead the Berlin Philharmonic. The concert itself, she felt, was a frightening spectacle, almost a journey back. Quote, Furtwängler's return was disturbingly reminiscent of a tribal ritual, celebrating the rebirth of a myth, as if welcoming a tortured prophet who had taken upon himself the guilt of them all and done penance for them. Everyone rose from their seats when he entered. Certainly it was miraculous how, despite a baton that seemed always to vibrate and a gesture in the utmost trance, the conductor brought about an unheard of power and cohesion in the orchestra. Yet the mass hysteria he produced in his audience was full of warning signs. The poor things, an outsider said after the concert, they haven't been allowed such a coming together since the last Nuremberg party rally. But why was Furtwängler, despite his deep entanglement with the Nazis, allowed to perform again so soon? Because the American officer who had to decide the matter was none other than Ernst Lothar, whom I just quoted. His interrogation of Furtwängler proceeded, as he reports in his autobiography, as follows. Rarely has an interrogation been shorter. He opened it, not I. You wanted to see me, he asked. Thank you for coming, I replied. And that was that. On the spot, we had become friends. One can read this with a smile or with horror. Both reactions are probably justified. Friendship is never a bad thing, of course. But there is something genuinely shocking in the way Lothar keeps his accusations against society in the abstract, and then drops them the moment he's faced with a concrete person. Precisely the reproach raised in Döblin's Hamlet against storytellers. Guilt dissolves in the individual. The concrete in its everydayness seems to erase any metaphysical weight of wrongdoing. An unusual but very serious way of dealing with one's own wrongdoing was shown by the most important Austrian novelist of the second half of the 20th century, Heimito von Doderer. As a young, unsuccessful writer, he joined the NSDAP as early as 1933, long before such membership brought advantages. I'm really not sure whether that should count in his favor or against him. At a time when the party was still banned in his native Austria. The years that followed brought disillusionment. Doderer wrote in his diary of a barbaric era and became an author of profound self-disgust. My actual work consists in all seriousness not of prose or verse, he wrote later in his only short autobiographical text, but of recognizing my stupidity. The recognition of stupidity and confusion, the liberation from narrowness of mind and soul became the central theme of his work. Yet he never wrote about his own entanglement with the Nazi party. In his masterpiece, The Strudelhof Steps, Doderer describes in a sprawling social panorama how the young officer Meltzer, back from the First World War, educates himself into a responsible, lucid individual. And in his wild comedy, Die Posaunen von Jericho, The Trumpets of Jericho, a fundamentally proper civil servant becomes entangled in sleazy sexual escapades, only to return in the end to self-control and reason. Doderer might have remained unknown to the public because as an ideologically tainted writer he could have been barred from publishing, but no other than Hilde Spiel intervened on his behalf, and The Strudelhof Steps was published to huge success in 1951. 15 years later, Doderer, widely revered yet still notorious, published his short story Unter schwarzen Sternen, Under Black Stars. Perhaps the most enigmatic and artistically complicated interior view of the Third Reich in all of German literature. The story is about a group of people who meet regularly in Vienna in the darkest years of the dictatorship, each vaguely opposed to the regime, none inclined to resistance. And it begins realistically and rises to the strangely surreal climax of a black mass. When I wrote my novel, The Director, that brief, mysterious story felt like my most immediate window into the Third Reich. More even than all the diaries and letters I had read. Because it justifies nothing and prettifies nothing, yet is written without the slightest indignation, at once from a distance and from a close proximity that no exile could naturally produce. It gives of all the texts I have read the most intimate sense for how it must have felt to be surrounded by the totalitarian state, perpetually twisted into the absurd. How did anyone even manage then to keep getting out of bed in the morning day after day, the first person narrator asks. And I chose that passage as the motto of my novel, The Director. Heaved up and drifting along on a broad wave of absurdity, although we knew and saw it, which made it all the worse. But in the end, this very knowledge was what kept us alive, while others, far better than we, were swallowed up. That broad wave of absurdity and the fog it brings about are, in a sense, where novelists are at home. That is the beauty of my profession, and if one is to believe Döblin's Edward Allison, it's peculiar moral problem. I need hardly point out that in Russia or Turkey or Hungary or Israel, and yes, in the United States, when better times return, and they will, justice will not be established fully. That does not mean one should forgive everything and, like Kleist's Marquise of O, marry one's rapist for the sake of the frail constitution of the world, as Kleist is putting it in one of his most beautiful and mysterious phrases, wegen der gebrechlichen Einrichtung der Welt. But it does mean that there is a German novel about the aftermath of dictatorship that has not been written because it is so hard to write. For it would have to treat the coexistence, the smear time, the disturbing foggy world of shadows, ghosts, and compromises. I will tell you frankly, for a long time I dreamt of writing that novel. But apparently it proved too hard for me, and all that remains from my attempt is one chapter in The Director about G.W. Pabst shooting his very strange post-war film Geheimnisvolle Tiefe, Mysterious Depth, with a cast and crew of former exiles and some Nazis and some people who were neither one nor the other. Yet, even the thickest fog lifts eventually. In 1959, Frankfurt's Attorney General Fritz Bauer, himself a returned emigrant, together with a team of young, dedicated prosecutors, opens proceedings against 22 men who had kept the Auschwitz concentration camp running in a wide variety of roles. Bauer's theory that every person casually involved in the functioning of a crime bears the full weight of complicity, interestingly a standard element of mafia investigations under the RICO statute in the United States today, initially meets with utter incomprehension in Germany. When Bauer, as the man indicted who was in charge of the laundry at Auschwitz, part of the public considers him simply insane. But Bauer does not conduct a trial in order to win. He conducts it to dispel the fog. The writer Robert Neumann attends the proceedings and is shaken by how unremarkable the people in the dock appear. Quote, "The most uncanny thing, an impression only reinforced when, during recess, spectators, lawyers, defendants, policemen, and journalists mingle in the anteroom. The moment they are no longer in their assigned places, they become indistinguishable. Every lawyer a potential defendant, every policeman, if you don't look closely, wearing the uniform of the SS. Every defendant, your mailman, your bank clerk, your neighbor. You have to think it through to the end. It is deeply unsettling. The sentences are mild. The judges do not make things easy for the prosecution. Only 6 of the 22 defendants receive life sentences. Most get between 4 and 7 years, and the 2 who were not directly involved in killings, like the laundryman, are acquitted. The time is not yet ripe for Bauer's understanding of structural guilt, but it will be. In the wake of the Auschwitz trial, Germany gradually becomes a different country, so that the ground is prepared when, in 1968, a new generation comes of age and puts the question to their parents, what exactly did you do or fail to do during the dark years under black stars? Thank you.
Thank you, Danny Kehlmann. Thank you, Oliva. Thank you to the Mosse program for having me back. Because I didn't mess it up entirely. It was fun to discover that we both were wondering a little bit about what a response to your talk might entail. But if you think that's vaguely threatening, then consider that it's also vaguely intimidating, or at least daunting, to respond to Daniel Kehlmann, a published author of your caliber. So what I found myself doing was not so much trying to respond like I would to an academic argument as taking you up on the offer to think with some of the texts that you cite, and to think about them, and also to think about yours. Although it sounds like I would be better served by reading some lines from your plays together, since that brings great results. I also should say that I'm going to I was wondering about this, and you're sitting here. I'm not going to say Mr. Kehlmann or Daniel Kehlmann. I'm going to say Kehlmann, like people do with authors, like you just did with Döblin and Bachmann. I hope that's okay. The compelling lecture we just heard was advertised under a title phrase taken from Döblin's last novel, The Long Night Comes to an End, which, let's be honest, is quite a proposition to add somewhat indecisively to the title filched from Shakespeare. Hamlet or The Long Night Comes to an End. But Daniel Kehlmann might equally well have taken his title from the question that animates Ingeborg Bachmann's short story, Among Murderers and Madmen. Why are we sitting together? Or we could have chosen Wretched Concord. This is Bachmann's question and Kehlmann's. Why would perpetrators and victims sit together in the aftermath of war and genocide? Or perhaps, why wouldn't they? Or how couldn't they? How, in a word, does a society reconstitute sociality in the aftermath of totalitarianism when living together means living unter Mördern und Irren among murderers and madmen in Bachmann's title, and the murderers are among us in Wolfgang Staudte's? Literary authors that they are, both Bachmann and Kehlmann go one step further to ask, imagine, and narrate how such a gathering might take place, what it would look and feel like, who would be implicated, how, and from which perspective. At stake, if I read it correctly, is nothing less than a poetics of the post-war. In Bachmann's short story, this involves adopting the perspective of the victims, the three émigrés and the unnamed narrator who've returned to Vienna 10 years after the war to join the three Wehrmacht veterans at the table for an evening of drink, talk, and expressing opinions. Trinken und reden und meinen. In the Kronenkeller. Through the presumably Jewish narrator's eyes, would you agree that one thinks the narrator is Jewish? Yes. We see the depravity of a society that carries on and clings to military memories stripped of guilt and responsibility. We see the revulsion that this causes the Jewish listeners who voice their objections far too quietly before they throw up in the bathroom. And to be sure, we learn about those excluded from such Herrenabende, the wives who go to bed, quote, with thoughts of vengeance in the lonely house, end of quote, and who dream, these are quotes from Bachmann, of, quote, murdering their husbands, making them die in car crashes, of heart attacks and pneumonia, making them die quickly or slowly and miserably. Such furies presage the murder with which the sitting together ends outside the Kronenkeller. And yet, from this cataclysm, we learn nothing, as Kehlmann insists with Bachmann. The victims show no way. In a dialectical twist, though, this vacuum creates the space for literature in Kehlmann's estimation. The absurdity of the situation and the fog it brings about, he says, are in a sense where the novelist is at home. It's a haunted home, to be sure. I'm quoting you here, a disturbing, foggy world of shadows, ghosts, and compromises, whose textures it becomes the author's task to preserve rather than dispel. The yet-to-be-written novel of the aftermath, then, would need to capture such atmospherics. And even though he admits defeat for now, in devising such a novel, Kehlmann has assembled a robust writer's room with Döblin, Bachmann, and Doderer as his guides. And with today's lecture, he offers them now as our guides, too, for reading the chapter of the yet-to-be-written novel that made it into the novel Kehlmann did write, the chapter on Papst's 1949 film, Mysterious Shadows, Geheimnisvolle Tiefe, in The Director. I'll get back to this. But first I want to propose briefly expanding Kehlmann's trio by adding three other voices from those years. Those of Siegfried Kracauer, Hannah Arendt, and Gabriele Tergit, Jewish émigrés whose writings complement and complicate the three Jews ventriloquized in Bachmann's text. Picking up the narrative in or about 1950, I turn to them to ask how the we is constituted that sits together here, whether in Bachmann's Kronenkeller or, as we'll see, in a nameless inn, a Gasthof in an unnamed lower Austrian village in Lichtspiel, in The Director. No matter how they're imagined literarily, such gatherings are perforce constituted by absence. Not just by the absence of the vengeful wives at home in Bachmann's story, but also by the absence of those emigres who deliberately stayed away rather than take a seat at the table. Emigres like the film critic Siegfried Krakauer, who in a letter from 1950 writes that he and his wife Lily, quote, would never think of returning to Germany, a country that he describes in terms strikingly similar to Kehlmann's. The air over there, writes Krakauer, has been poisoned for the foreseeable future, and one doesn't know whose hand one is shaking. Returning would require, quote, mingling again with the ghosts, the Spukgestalten, of his past, an unimaginable, really, prospect for Krakauer in 1950. Though he would revise his stance and eventually return to Europe for regular visits, he shares Hannah Arendt's exasperation in her report on her erstwhile compatriots in the aftermath of Nazi rule, written like Krakauer's letter in 1950. She too seems spooked by zombie-like Germans, whom she describes as, quote, speechless, incapable of articulating thoughts and adequately expressing their feelings. Amid the ruins, she writes, Germans mail each other picture postcards still showing the cathedrals and marketplaces, the public buildings and bridges that no longer exist. And the indifference with which they walk through the rubble has its exact counterpart in the absence of mourning for the dead. End of quote. If the undead haunt the aftermath as Spukgestalten, or ghosts from the past, it's of course the absence of the unmourned dead themselves that determines the limits and possibility of any sociality when the long night comes to an end, if it ever does. This, I take it, is the empty center around which Kehlmann finds Döblin's novel to be constructed, the erratic block around which its Decameron stories circle. For in the aftermath, why are we sitting together, for heaven's sake, begs that other question of who is left standing in the first place. This question too, is an eminently literary one, as evidenced in ongoing, long-standing, searching debates about the representability of the Holocaust, about poetry after Auschwitz, and about Luftkrieg und Literatur as the alliterative title of Sebald's influential lectures on air war and literature had it in the original German. I have no intention of rehearsing these debates here. But as a monument to that absence, let me just quote the closing lines of Gabriele Taggett's remarkable Effingers, a Jewish family chronicle that she published with difficulty and to resounding silence in Germany in 1951, but which stands as a gift to the history of the German novel, in my opinion. Having chronicled over half a century of Jewish life while she herself was on the run in exile from Prague to Palestine to England, and while Jewish life in Germany was being all but extinguished, Taggett resurrects a bygone life world. In its historical sweep, the novel admittedly moves away from the vexing post-war present with which Döblin and Bachmann, Doderer, and also Kehlmann are concerned, but the brief and poignant final chapter brings us to Berlin Tiergarten after the long night has come to an end. The novel fades out on what Taggett calls a Pompeian ruinscape, the formerly bustling Tiergartenstrasse, and here's the quote, quiet now. People no longer greeted each other on Sunday mornings, as there was hardly a soul left in the entire neighborhood. Most people had scattered to the four corners of the earth, or were buried beneath the rubble. If they were Jews, they had been claimed by eternity, which is Sophie Duvernoy's translation for Soweit sie Juden waren, waren sie angesiedelt worden für die Ewigkeit, literally settled or relocated for eternity. The quiet at the end of Taggett's novel is both less and more than the cartel of silence that Kehlmann invokes. Less, because it's shot through with hope. The novel's last action has the maid Frida planting corn in the sweet springtime air on a Saturday evening in May 1948. I wonder how melodramatic Kehlmann would consider this ending. But the quiet is also more than the cartel of silence because the absence of the Jews is, quote, eternal. No characters of her multi-generational epic remain alive to sit again among the murderers and madmen. Nor did Taggett ever remigrate to Germany except for the occasional visit when the novel flickered back to life at a literary festival in the late 1970s. From Kehlmann's reading of Döblin, Doderer, Bachmann, we learned that literature's role after the proverbial fog of war is to dwell in the aftermath and in the aftermath's own fog. Taggart moves in the opposite direction. In a style that retains markers of her new objectivity beginnings, she paints the atmosphere spring-like and bright. Not because there's no question of guilt here, but because the sadness and mourning are clear. The recognition of murder and genocide clear-eyed. And yes, because perhaps there's also hope. Effengas is a marvel of a novel and something of a unicorn to be sure. But I bring it up here because it seems to me that its empirical existence, I'm almost tempted to say its survival, requires some accounting in any poetics of the post-war years. I also mention it as the exception to prove Kehlmann's rule, which seems to me persuasive, that literature in the aftermath is at home in, quote, that strange fog in which émigrés lived alongside former perpetrators to form this curious cartel of silence. And that even in this fog, literature humanizes through concretion, where moral philosophy abstracts, because, quoting Kehlmann, whoever tells a story is forgiving his characters from the outset. Which brings me back to that dark and stormy night in the lower Austrian backcountry, where a returning Jewish émigré first loses and then makes his way to the local Gasthaus. That's the setup for the chapter titled Tiefe, which opens the last section of Lichtspiel titled Danach. And I didn't look it up. What's the English for that? Is it later, afterwards, or just the aftermath?
Good question. I think it's just after.
After, okay. I'll add math, aftermath. That chapter reimagines Bachmann's scenario of sitting together in the form of a film production meeting among former Interstadt cameramen, émigré producers, Nazi technicians, and Jewish sound engineers alongside the novel's debased protagonist, G.W. Pabst, and his wife-turned-screenwriter, Trude. Armed with the insights Kehlmann shared here today, it would be tempting to reverse engineer the construction of this scene, enveloped as it is by smoke that, quote, hangs under the ceiling like a gray fog. We'll have to leave it to future critics and graduate seminars to draw out Kehlmann's debt to Doderer and Bachmann in outlining a tenuous sociality where, quote from the novel, everyone is polite again and everything has become mixed up. Instead, let me just restate the obvious, that the post-war poetics that Kehlmann outlined for us today are also his own. Which is by no means to say that he writes in any way like Bachmann, Doderer, or Döblin, but that he incorporates them into his own endlessly inventive literary idiom to counter moral or moralizing abstraction with empathetic concreteness, refusing to allow for the possibility that human beings don't exist, dass es den Menschen nicht gibt. Instead, a compromised figure like G.W. Pabst becomes the occasion to explore the play of light and dark that makes up a Lichtspiel, to show Pabst clueless under the blaring sun of Hollywood, and no wiser in the murky depths where the novel abandons him at the end of that chapter on Geheimnisvolle Tiefe. And in perhaps one of the boldest moves of this novel, Kehlmann translates the lessons of Döblin's proliferating storytellers into a question about the reliability of narration itself, framing the world of the director in the opening and closing chapters through the perspective of a man losing his memory. It's a brilliant set piece, unlike anything I've ever read, and maybe it's just because I haven't read enough. It's poignant, it's funny, it's frustrating, it's illuminating, it's never demeaning. It telescopes past and present, film history, individual memory, and the fictional imagination into an inextricably layered construction. If, as Kehlmann said today, quote, absurdity and the fog it brings about are, in a sense, where novelists are at home, then what better way to inhabit this home than to begin a novel about a filmmaker's moral failings with a first-person narrator who clearly witnessed but cannot recall the key elements of the plot. And what better way to convey, as Kehlmann put it today, that, quote, after the end of a dictatorship, the reckoning has to be maddeningly incomplete, and that it is the task of literature not to complete it, but to constantly rewrite its incompletion. On this note, let me conclude. Two things landed on my desk earlier this week. Daniel Kehlmann's draft for the lecture we heard today, and the most recent issue of New German Critique, the last one co-edited by George Mosse's student Andy Rabenbach, to whom Andreas Hüssen, another one of the co-editors, offers a moving tribute in memoriam at the beginning of the issue. The issue is titled German Memory Politics at a Crossroads, and I've been reading it less like a journal of scholarly articles and more like a book with a coherent argument about the latest turn in German memory culture towards silencing anti-Israeli protest in the name of Staatsräson and an instrumentalized notion of anti-Semitism. It's enough to turn the title of Döblin's book and today's lecture back into a question. Is the long night over? Did the fog really lift after the Auschwitz trials and the student movement of the 1960s? The literature of our present conjuncture has yet to be written. But there's every reason to believe, and perhaps even to hope, that it too will find ways of capturing our own smeared time by dwelling on, or sitting with, as the contemporary idiom goes, that disturbing, foggy world of shadows, ghosts, and compromises that Kehlmann has so powerfully recalled for us, both in his lecture today and in his most recent novel. Thank you.
I feel very honored and I like very much what he said, especially the last term where you're right. I mean, all of it, but it's really true that now we kind of have to ask did the fog actually and this. Anyway, so how do we do that? Are we supposed to talk now? Are we supposed to open for questions from the audience?
If you wish, but we can open anytime.
I think, should we, or what do you suggest?
And can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
One question?
Yeah.
Because I get to satisfy my curiosity, and maybe other people are curious too. I have a number of questions, but the one I mean, we could talk about, you know, how this post-war moment, literature, poetics connects to the present, which is obviously something you've been thinking about, and you published that novel in the present. But the question I actually have is more of a kind of informational and taking us a little further. It's about the story, the Doderer story, Unter Schwarzen Sternen, which you described as the most enigmatic and artistically complicated text of the era, and the most immediate window to the Third Reich, and really the driving, and you chose the motto. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about that story and why it's so important to you. The motto that you choose is about soldiering on despite the absurdity, and that's pretty clear. But the story, which you prompted me to read, is nuts. Yes. I mean, it's indecipherable in certain ways. It ends on on a twist that you wouldn't believe. We can do with or without spoilers, but I'm just curious if you could say a little bit more about how this story of all of them became so key.
I was kind of hoping no one would ask that. Because I'm happy to give you the incomplete answer that I have, because I find it, I mean, it's a very good question. I don't understand that story, I have to say. I'm not claiming I understand it. I'm not claiming there's something that you didn't get and I got. Absolutely not. I find it so amazing because Doderer has this unbelievable, whatever we want to call it, magic wand or machine or like device of his style and his way to turn everything he writes about. And usually he's really part of modernism in the way that he writes about not much. Not much is happening in his novels for hundreds of pages, and it's absolutely amazing because the writing is so good. So, and every sentence is so full of intelligence and a very strange way of looking at things. And he turns this ability towards the Third Reich for just 30 pages or something. And without really understanding what the story is about, it is about a group of people have kind of a jour fixe. They meet in regular terms, and it's not even spelled out that of course they don't talk about the dictatorship outside, because it's too dangerous, and also they kind of agree anyway. It's just, and then there is this insane ending, but you just feel what it's like in such an immediate and strong way through the brilliance of his sentences, the brilliance of his style, and in a way that I didn't find anywhere else. The only other place where I found something like this is some of the novels Ismail Kadari wrote about what it was like under Enver Hoxha in Albania. Because Kadari was also, he was not against it, and he was not for it. I mean, there's a huge debate about that in Albania. I don't want to get into any Albanian debate here in the Deutsches Haus. I'm just saying it's the only writer where I found something comparable. And with Doderer, without understanding that story, which I recommend to all of you, I think some of you are now quite curious and hopefully would be disappointed. When I read it, and I read it again and again, I felt in something I had in, for example, Fallada wrote this very, very long novel, Jeder stirbt für sich allein, which was also very interesting and helpful because he wrote it while this was going on secretly. But none of it felt as immediate and powerful as that Doderer story. And I can't really explain it, but whenever I felt lost or in writing my own novel, I went back to that story. And that's why I also chose it as a motto. And I still don't understand that story.
Great. The floor is open. Any questions, comments? Yes, please, in the back. I may have to, I'll run around. Easy.
Hi, thank you. That was a really interesting lecture. I'm interested in, I guess, your broader literary project. Because a lot, I mean, not all, but a lot of your works are engaging in the speculative and in the kind of possibilities of history if it's reimagined or hypothesized. And I'm interested in the points of view that you pick for that, because I was struck in your lecture about this idea of sitting at the table and all sitting together at the table, because I think in your writing it occurs to me that that is a form of sitting at the table. And the positions at the table that you've chosen to occupy, so Alexander Humboldt and Pabst and the others, I guess I'm just wondering how you choose where to sit and whose perspectives you choose to engage with, and maybe a more provocative question, whose perspectives you think deserve to be engaged with in your work. Thank you.
Yes, that's a very interesting point, that in a way, in a different but also an important way, writing about historical characters, I sit down at the table with them, and without having to be invited by the person, and I still do it. And to be honest, I'm not always feeling good about it. It is an intrusive act. It is an intrusive act to reinvent a historical figure. And it always feels like impolite, but also problematic. I will admit that. That person lived, and I'm turning that person into a character. Often a comic character, often somebody who I use for some form of comedy. And I think if I would lose my looming sense that there is something impolite and intrusive about that, I wouldn't be able to do it well anymore. It is, so I will own up to that. And every time I feel like, yes, this is something problematic and I'm still doing that, and I'm telling myself, that's what literature is about. Feeling something is slightly problematic, but you're still doing it. That's what makes it interesting. And if you feel like that's a very lame excuse, I don't disagree, but I don't have a better one. I do have another excuse, which is that another thing that many of the historic characters, maybe not Humboldt and Gauss, but some of the others have in common is that they're in some way powerful. And I always feel like the more somebody had power in their life, the more you can be intrusive and can make fun of them. Because it's kind of, they had all the power when they were alive, but now we have the power to make fun of them, and they can't do much against it. This is also a novel I just finished, which no one knows about. And I'm not going into detail, but there are lots of powerful men, and they're all morons. And it's a comedy. So I do feel you have more rights to invent things when the person you wrote about it was more powerful, and you have less rights and less, I wouldn't say artistic freedom, you have less freedom to do with them what you want when they had less power or no power at all. And this is not an abstract decision. This is something I feel when I'm doing this.
I'll just put a little spin on the question and ask if there are any characters who are like the ambassador that you sat next to, where you feel like you run the risk of being too conciliatory?
Yes.
Or whether literary authorship is the place where that gets kind of evened out.
It has to be evened out. I don't know of a moment when I feel or I think I was too conciliatory towards a literary character. And for moral reasons or also for other reasons, I mean, I also don't spare them. Bad things happen to literary characters, and you always feel like I want to spare them, but that's not what I do. But also when it comes to his, and not all my characters are historic characters, but I keep doing it because it's something apparently that is in the center of my work, and that's something I enjoy. I think literary writing is never where you should pull your punches. It's where you should go all out, if possible. And I often, it's not just about being too nice, like I was too nice to that man at the table. For example, when I wrote that chapter in Till about the dragon hunt, for those of you who might have read it, and the whole joke of that chapter, the whole running joke of that chapter is that people who think they're scientists and were scientists in the framework of the 17th century are looking for a dragon. And of course there are no dragons, obviously. No such thing exists. And I finished the chapter and it was all done, and I thought, okay, and now I'm actually writing a paragraph, just one paragraph about the dragon that they didn't find. And I felt like that's mad. And then I told myself, what I always tell myself in moments like that, it's not a problem. I'm alone here. I'm alone at my desk. I'm just going to write it. And if it's too insane, I will have had fun for 10 minutes and I can still take it out again. And I do that often. And I tell myself often, this is going too far. I can take it out again, but don't worry. And now comes the interesting thing, empirically. I never took out what I wrote in those moments when I felt I was going too far. And it usually ends up what I'm personally most proud about later. So I always feel bad when I didn't go all out. In writing, in life it's really different.
Thank you. Thank both of you for two absolutely fabulous presentations. I have a comment and a question. Can you hear now? It's better? Okay. Good. The comment is about Döblin's last novel, Hamlet and The Long Night Comes to an End, which I always thought was an absolutely terrible novel.
It is quite
And not only because of its sentimental religious ending, but your comments have sort of encouraged me to think about it in somewhat different ways. I'm not quite sure how yet, but there was some interesting stuff about the narrative structure. But my question relates to something else. It relates to the sitting together of perpetrators and victims. I grew up in West Germany in the 1950s, so I know what this story is about. But I suddenly wondered to what extent the sitting together of perpetrators and victims has had broader social effects, namely the identification of the perpetrators as victims, the victimology of the perpetrators, which was really huge in Austria, of course. The Austrians who saw themselves always as the victims of the Nazis, forgetting the celebrations and the jubilation when Hitler came to Vienna during the Anschluss, and in Germany in the same way. Victims of the bombings, of the Allied bombings, and so forth. We know those stories. So I just wondered to what extent is that sitting together the precondition for that kind of mentality or not. And I'm trying to think about literary examples that might get into that. In the Bachmann story, it's interesting. The victimology is not yet there among these guys in the killer, right? It's a dimension that is not in the story. But it certainly was already there in Austria at that time when she wrote it.
Thank you. I mean, it came first, one more thing. I don't want to defend the Döblin novel. It is a terrible novel. You're right about that. But it's still Döblin, and that means it still has amazing passages. There are some passages in it which I would have loved to quote, but then I thought it's not relevant for what I'm talking about here, about what it's like when your son died, where you really feel like he kind of left the framework of the novel and was just describing his bottomless grief, and it's so heartbreaking and well written and amazing, but it doesn't really fit well into the novel, and it's not a successful novel in artistic terms. You're absolutely right about that. The sitting together, I don't have a good answer to that, other than, and I don't want to judge it, because I feel there was no way to really avoid it. That's my point. I just find it interesting and remarkable how it reflects in those works of literature, and how the people who came back, how they perceived it. Like Hilde Spiel, who is completely thrown about it in the very beginning already, and very early in her book Rückkehr nach Wien, Return to Vienna, which she published later, but it's notes she took in January 46 already. People are already telling her, you had it much better than us under the bombs. But also, people did have it terrible under the bombs, so it's not something they just made up. So I would. My point is kind of, I mean, I am very judgmental. I don't want to come across as not passing any judgment, but that's particular phenomenon that they had to sit together again. And in a different talk in my Frankfurter Poetikvorlesungen, I was talking about, I was looking at some of the post-war films made in the 50s in Germany, and was talking about the fact that they are not just awful, they're awful in a way that's so insane that they're today unwatchable. German comedies from the 50s, and you have to look at them on YouTube. They're just like, you wouldn't believe that something like that was made.
Johannes, of course, wrote a wonderful book about that.
I spent many years looking at them.
Did you like them?
No.
And so my point about those films, and you can say more about that, my point about these films was not just they were bad, anybody can make bad films, they were kind of, you can see the deep social neurosis, because they were actually made by victims and perpetrators together. And some of the people who made those films, they're really astonishing. There's a director called Gesa von Ziffra, who made some of the worst films. Again, you cannot believe that something like that is possible. But he was a close friend of Joseph Roth, and wrote a deeply moving memoir about his friendship to Joseph Roth in exile in Paris. And it's really impossible to bring that together. And so that's why those German films were interesting for me, because I thought you can see them. You can see the deep neurosis. It's actually, it becomes visible in so many ways. But you know more about that.
But I think I'm not going to go there. I think the question is, or the hunch is really interesting, right? That the silence that we've all talked about for a long time, and that's kind of a given, to which you're pushing back. I mean, you're saying, sort of like Foucault says about sexuality, there's actually more talk rather than less. And that's also a position that some people have taken. But the idea that the silence, even if people were talking a lot, that they stayed silent about positionalities. And I think one thing I didn't put in the response, but that I was thinking while reading your talk, is also, if we think about this through the lens of resistance that there was against the Nazis, those are traitors still at that moment, right? I mean,
yes.
They are called out as traitors until at least in the 60s, maybe past 68. And so that the inability to name positionalities, which maybe is linked to the inability to mourn, becomes a precondition for this victim identification, because nobody says, no, you can't do that. And I think that's a really good hunch, yeah.
I haven't seen those bad films, but I'm super curious. Also, what makes them bad?
You won't be able to watch one from beginning to end.
Okay.
You won't be able to.
This is how they name.
You have to call it, right?
I mean, Döblin is already tough, I have to say, and I think it has to do with the ending and the difficulty to find a narrative solution. You mentioned narratives quite a bit now, and you also use these temporal aftermath signifiers that indicate that there is a before and an after and a beginning and an ending. So I was wondering if you could talk a little more about this temporality and the narrative perspective.
You mean at the ending, the melody?
The ending, I mean, it seems to me that Döblin is struggling with the end, not only there, I mean, in the novels as well. You always have this. And Bachmann, I think, is also an interesting case, because there is something like, there is a murder happening, and it's almost like a sacrifice or a death. But without much symbolic quality, it seems, or at least there's no catharsis. But there is a similar problem there, how to end the story. And your fogginess and what you described, the entire archive that you unpacked, seem to be so insistent on more like the middle, the dissolution, the continuation. So I'm wondering, what does it mean then to talk about after in that context?
Oh, sorry.
You didn't mention the Doderer story, which also has a very, it still feels, because Doderer is so in control and so masterful, the ending doesn't feel like the story got away from him, but it's still a strange and melodramatic ending. So that's something many of these texts seem to have in common. And I would assume it has something to do with writing about a conflict which you want resolved in some way deeply. You have an urge to see this conflict resolved, but you don't know how to resolve it. And it is hard to end any literary text, and I feel like there's more psychological than an aesthetic explanation to that. When you cannot resolve what you are opening up as a conflict, then you naturally resort to melodrama. Because melodrama is a form of pseudo-resolution, and it comes easy. It's not a profound resolution, it's an easy way out in a way. If you ask me something like that and I don't know the answer, I just can shout, I think the room is burning, and I run out. And that's kind of going for the melodrama resolution. And so that's a psychological theory. I'm not sure about it, but thinking about it right now, it says something about the state of mind of the people writing those stories. Because of course melodrama is what you do when you're not a great writer, and these are all great writers. But at some point in those texts, they cease to be the great writers they were in the middle of the story. And I think that says something about them dealing with things they couldn't resolve themselves.
I've got to say a word in defense of melodrama. Coming from film studies, where melodrama was a real discovery, and especially the women's films of the 1940s and 50s, when the industry turns to women as subjects because they are also the spectators, because the men are at war, and then feminist film scholars discovered melodrama and kind of read and reread and reread it. And one of my favorite formulations, and this is directly to your point, I think it was Linda Williams who said, she would agree that melodrama is like Stella Dallas ends with a kind of flourish that is completely unbelievable. Douglas Sirk also always said, I have really breathtaking endings, but they were just mush. And Linda Williams said, but it's not the end point of the road that's interesting, it's the dirt that got kicked up on the way.
Yeah.
And I think that's essentially what you're saying. And all I'm saying is that melodrama can do that too. Kick up some dirt. Yeah, constant dirt.
Yeah, thank you for the defense of melodrama, but I wanted to go back to sort of like what's circling in my mind, and that's not even really a full-fledged question, but first of all, thank you both for this wonderful lecture and response. And basically I'm sitting here with, okay, and where to go from there? If the sitting together is a problem, and the form of that sociality seems to almost like really predispose towards not working things through. Maybe it was then not accidental that in the 60s there was a trial, like in the passing of judgment, which is a different form that really brought about a change. And then a student actions and tomatoes thrown, etc. It also did not quite take the form of talking and Habermasian dialogue being thrown out, etc. As we're returning to this today, our campus administrators are urging us to have conversations across the aisle. And this question of dialogue is so central to the fiction of how to resolve our own situation right now, that I'm sort of now wondering in which ways are we coming full circle, or where are we going, or what are we overlooking in that whole puzzle?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That was kind of my point. I wanted to think in that direction without having a clear solution, but I've been thinking about that a lot in America, because there's so much talk about America being too polarized, and I keep thinking, on the level of the upper echelons of society, it's by far not polarized enough. Everybody seems to be friends with everybody. And even though, well, at that table I was talking about, some of the Democrats with a large D, they knew that guy would have them arrested. But I mean, it seems not real to them. It still feels like we all kind of can be friends. There's an interesting piece in the Zeit today about a gathering of philosophers in Schloss Elmau, that elegant castle, and they invited Curtis Yarvin, the fascist. Like I think he probably wouldn't even disagree with that characterization. And first, I was really shocked when that happened. Not so much because philosophers invite Curtis Yarvin and want to talk to him, even though that's ridiculous too, but an argument can be made for that. Like, let's hear that, whether he has anything interesting to say. But at the same place, a year ago, I was asked to put together a symposium, and I was told that I couldn't invite the great philosopher Onkel Böhm because he's so critical of Israel. So it's not like we talk to everyone and we are free speech fundamentalists. In Germany, it's now we're free speech fundamentalists as long as someone likes Netanyahu. And that will include the extreme right. That will include the extreme right because they like Netanyahu, so how can they be bad? And that's one thing that I found so problematic about that, sitting together. But then I was waiting. I knew that a very good young journalist was writing that piece, which came out today. And she has a few wonderful observations about Yarvin, which I really encourage you all to read. It's very interesting. She does a very good job of making things visible by withholding judgment, which I think good reporters maybe not should. There are different ways to do it, but it's one way of being a good reporter, to just say what you see. And one of the things she's saying in that piece is how well Curtis Yarvin got along with Alex Soros. And they really liked each other, apparently, because they had a nice chat, and you can have a nice chat with everybody. So they were literally sitting together. And Yarvin goes around the world talking about that people like Soros should be arrested and disappeared and whatever. But it's all not so serious when you sit together in a nice gathering. And it's not Yarvin who's defending that. I would get that. It's actually in that piece Soros who's defending that. Who's saying, oh, it's interesting, and he's a nice guy. And it seems like on his level of wealth, cannot even imagine anything could ever happen to him. And so the problem is, I've been thinking about that Bachmann story, but in that case, at least those people don't have power anymore. At least the crimes of these people are in the past. So you are kind of free to ignore or forgive them if you feel like it. Or to become friends, like Ernst Lothar and Furtwängler. And Furtwängler didn't commit any crimes. I mean, it was just awesome how he behaved. But here we have people who proactively forgive future crimes just because we're all on the level of wealth and comfort that those people have. We can just all hang out together, and I find that even more disturbing. And I see that, especially in America, I see that everywhere. There are many, many things you can say against Germany, obviously, but I haven't been invited anywhere where I met AfD people. There is a real social stigma on being a fascist. And that, it's not like it just has disappeared in America. It was never quite there. And we can talk about, but I think it would be a different event. We could talk about why that's the case. I think it's also because so many institutions just need money. They need the money from Republican donors. So that guy was at that dinner because he was a big-time Republican donor. And without him, probably that evening couldn't even have happened, or that was the opening of an exhibition, so that exhibition couldn't have existed. So yeah, it's a different situation here, and it's bad.
Well, I wonder, I've heard sitting together perhaps a little too much, and also this idea of conspiracy of silence. Now, partly based on my own experience, I grew up in the Black Forest in a small town, partly doing research in Darmstadt about post-war biography. I observed two things. First of all, sitting together, people, that is Germans or hometown people, were sitting apart. That is, the Nazis went to one pub and the Catholics went to another pub. Certain people were effectively excluded from anything, some for reasons because they were in the SS, some because they were returning. So there is, in other words, from a social historian's point of view, a very differentiated landscape of speaking and non-speaking. Now, and I wondered if there were a literary device to actually articulate this non-speaking, this sitting together, sitting apart. That's the one thing. The other thing that seems to me equally important is the kind of temporal structure of this. I mean, both in Darmstadt, which is a significant town, which was firebombed by the British, right? As well as in this small town in the Black Forest of 2,000 people, everybody knew what everybody else did. So the conspiracy of silence was not a conspiracy of non-knowledge. That is a problem of the next generation. That is, my brother is, I'm born in 47, my brother is 10 years younger, 1957. He knows at one and the same time a lot more than I've encountered in growing up, and knows much less. So the wave of making explicit, that is making knowledge public, that was implicit in how you related to your baker, who happened to have been in the SS, right? That kind of making explicit is a process that actually begins in the 1950s but takes shape really only in the 60s and fundamentally only in the 70s, 80s. Now, I do agree this is a powerful and convincing trope. The Germans sitting together, or the Austrians sitting together, or the locals sitting together. I wonder if there is a literature that actually reflects the Social Democrats who were sitting together and were coming back from concentration camps, or coming back from emigration, brought along maybe a Jewish wife, etc., etc. Those are stories that probably they could fund a literary and indeed a filmic impression.
I mean, thank you very much for that remark. This just shows for me how complicated it all is. And it's also relevant that the not sitting together, the separatedness you described, that happened in the Schwarzwald, you said, right? And I think it was different in Vienna, but of course it might have been even different in different parts of Vienna. And that was a very good point about that people did actually sing a songwriter. Comedian doesn't quite cover it, more of a poet who came back after the war, and he wrote a great poem a song called Der Weg zur Arbeit, The Way to Work, just about a man going to work. You can guess that it's in the early 50s, and just thinking what all the people he sees, and he knows it about everyone, did in the war. I was not able to translate it well, that's why I didn't include it, to be honest. So, and there is no English translation by anyone else, so I tried and failed. Otherwise, I would have mentioned it. But I think that's a very good point. I cannot think of any contemporary, works from back then that are really covering that phenomenon. There is a new novel, very recently translated into English, Dunkelblue, by Eva Menasse, about a small Austrian village where, well, you're never sure. Did everyone know everything, or did people, but it's about information, contradictory information slowly emerging from the silence. And it's an absolutely brilliant and quite hard to read novel for that reason. It has to be, because you're always very confused, which is the point. And it's a wonderful book, but it's from today. It literally came out in English last year.
So I think we won't find an end. Will also be a continuation here with the reception, so please stick around. But first, thank you both for these.